This is Adeline Baxter, producer of Talk of Alaska, Alaska Insight, and Line 1 Your Health Connection. You're listening to KSKA Anchorage on Alaska Public Media, FM 91.1. Connecting Alaskans, life informed.
A new book forces us to see reality TV as a mirror held up to society and why we should take it more seriously.
There was one study that showed that heavy consumers of reality TV are more likely to drink alcohol. They're also more likely to go hot tubbing on dates.
More on True Story, What Reality TV Says About Us, by author Danielle Lindemann. Next time on It's Been a Minute from NPR.
Saturday at 11 a.m. on Alaska Public Media, FM 91.1.
It's an expensive cycle. Insurance, gas, maintenance. Let us help break it by turning that car of yours into public radio. If your car is more work than it's useful, donate it to us. We'll pick it up, get top dollar for it, and use the funds to bring you more of your favorite shows. You might even qualify for a tax deduction.
Go to alaskapublic.org/vehicle today.
From NPR News in Washington, D.C., this is Weekend Edition. I'm Scott Simon. This hour, the latest is many of Washington, D.C.'s elite test positive for COVID, that is. Also, are China and Russia now aligned against the U.S. and Europe? Did major media fail in failing to report about emails on Hunter Biden's laptop? A powerful new film about the grim life of a dairy cow, and Delia Ephron's new memoir of losing many close to her than contending with leukemia. But a love straight out of one of her movies comes along.
I was dealing with so much grief, and falling in love was like beautiful magic. There's nothing like falling in love.
But it wasn't with Tom Hanks. First, our newscast. It's Saturday, April 9, 2022.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Windsor Johnston. Civilian evacuations are moving ahead in parts of Ukraine. A day after a missile strike killed at least 50 people at a train station in the eastern part of the country. NPR's Ada Peralta reports Ukrainian officials are urging people to flee while there's still time.
What's happening here is that the Ukrainian government believes that the Russian troops that have retreated from the capital region are regrouping in Belarus, and the Ukrainian government says that sometime in the near future they will begin attacking in the east. So people are trying to get ahead of that, and they're rushing to train stations. And now authorities here are saying that civilians should still continue to evacuate, and because the Kramatorsk train station is now inoperable, they have started busing people to another nearby station.
That's NPR's Ada Peralta reporting from the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling Friday's missile strike on the train station in eastern Ukraine the latest sign of Russian war crimes. NPR's Tom Bowman reports top defense officials in the U.S. say they're not buying Russia's denial that it was responsible for the attack.
The Russian Defense Ministry claims a missile that struck the station was only used by Ukraine's military, but a senior U.S. defense official said it was a Russian SS-21 missile that slammed into the train station in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russian forces appear to be regrouping in Belarus and Russia for a major offensive in the Donbas area. The senior defense official said some of those troops are resupplying in a Russian town just over the border in Russia and are expected to head south into Donbas. Pentagon officials and defense analysts say they expect Russian forces to attempt to box in Ukrainian troops and prevent them from moving or getting resupplied. Tom Bowman, NPR News, Washington.
The Supreme Court in Idaho has temporarily blocked a new state law that would ban abortion after about 6 weeks of pregnancy. Boise State Public Radio's James Dawson reports the law was scheduled to take effect later this month.
The law would ban most abortions in Idaho after 6 weeks of pregnancy. It had been set to take effect April 22nd. Family members of an aborted fetus could also sue the doctor who performs the procedure But the state Supreme Court has stopped its implementation while it considers a lawsuit filed by a regional arm of Planned Parenthood. State lawyers argued earlier this week that they need more time than the 2 weeks the court initially gave them to build their defense. Planned Parenthood says the law is unconstitutional on several grounds, which the Idaho Attorney General's office outlined in an opinion earlier this year. For NPR News, I'm James Dawson in Boise.
This is NPR News. The governor of Kentucky has vetoed a Republican-backed measure that would ban abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Governor Andy Beshear is raising concerns about the bill's constitutionality. He's also criticizing the measure for not including exceptions for pregnancies caused by rape or incest. A federal judge in Boston has sentenced the man known as the mastermind behind the college admission scheme dubbed Varsity Blues to 4 months in prison and 2 years of supervised release. Kurt Carapezza from member station GBH in Boston has more.
Harvard graduate Mark Riddell admits he took the SAT and ACT for students in exchange for cash to help the kids of wealthy parents get admitted to selective colleges like Georgetown and USC. The former prep school administrator fixed their answers, playing a key role in the nationwide scandal that included celebrities, executives, and coaches. On the day he pleaded guilty, Riddell told the court he was profoundly sorry for taking part in the scheme that revealed a pretty ugly side to this country's college admissions process. For NPR News, I'm Kurt Carapezza in Boston.
Civil rights groups say they're planning to challenge a new law in Alabama that targets transgender youth. Republican Governor Kay Ivey signed a bill that prohibits gender-affirming medical treatments for transgender youth. The legislation also requires public school students to use restrooms according to the gender on their birth certificate. You're listening to NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the William T. Grant Foundation, working to harness the power of research to make a difference in the lives of children, teens, and young adults for more than 80 years. Learn more at WTGrantFDN.org.
Hi, this is reporter Wesley Early. You're listening to Alaska Public Media on KSKA Anchorage FM 91.1, connecting Alaskans, life informed.
Weekend edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon. Some of the most powerful political figures in the nation's capital contracted COVID-19 this week. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senator Susan Collins of Maine, Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. Many of them tested positive after they attended the Gridiron Club dinner a week ago, an annual event for political and media elite. And it reflects a surge in cases in some parts of the country. NPR's Selena Simmons-Duffin joins us.
Hi, good morning.
What do we know about this this outbreak? A dinner that's being called a super spreader event?
Right, so not everyone on the high-profile list of positive cases were at the dinner, but at least 50 people who attended did test positive afterwards. Now, guests had to show proof of vaccination, but attendees did not uniformly wear masks, and there were no negative test requirements. And this is in the context of cases, as you say, rising here in D.C., and the dominant variant in the U.S. right now, BA2, is extremely contagious. And there were about 700 people indoors at this event, and that's still risky.
Of course, President Biden worked closely with many of those people who did get infected. He's 79 years of age. He has had a second booster. What does the White House say about the president's risk of exposure?
Yeah, in fact, the president usually attends the annual dinner, but this year, President Biden did not. He sent a video message instead. I asked Natalie Quillian, the outgoing deputy coordinator for the White House COVID-19 response team, about the president's risk, and here's what she said.
Is it possible that he, like many Americans, could get COVID? It is possible. But also, like many Americans, we believe and he can move forward safely with his routines as President of the United States.
She said the president has strong protocols and his vaccine doses protecting him.
Later this week, a federal appeals court upheld the vaccine mandate for federal employees that had been blocked for months. What does this mean for workers?
Well, this was a panel in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the judges said that the lower court judge who had blocked it didn't have jurisdiction. They reasoned that if a federal worker has a problem with the vaccine rule, they need to use an internal review process, not sue in federal court. Erin Fusay-Brown teaches law at Georgia State University. She told me in practical terms, the injunction's gone.
And so, in theory, yes, the federal government, as an employer, could start enforcing the vaccine mandate.
But the people who might be affected here are only a very small portion of the workforce, maybe like 3%, who both are unvaccinated and do not have an exemption. And it's not clear if the federal government is going to jump in and start enforcing this. The White House's Quillian told me they're just working through next steps at this point.
Finally, Congress left for spring recess without passing another package of COVID spending. This one would have been worth $10 billion. What happens now?
Well, already uninsured people can no longer get free vaccines or tests or treatments across the country. The administration warns more cuts are coming if Congress can't get more funding approved soon. Quillian told me the White House wants even more, $22.5 billion. And she pointed to a study from Yale and the Commonwealth Fund out yesterday that they assessed the value of the vaccination campaign so far.
It said we've avoided almost $900 billion in healthcare costs and saved 2 million lives. I think an investment of $22 billion to save even more lives and prevent even more costs to our economy and our healthcare system is well worth it.
She said she hopes lawmakers act quickly on this when they get back to Washington on April 25th.
That's NPR's Selena Simmons-Duffin. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Vladimir Putin made a grand appearance with the president of China, Xi Jinping, in Beijing in February. China has so far been largely silent about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Is there a new coalition forming? Al Brands is a professor of global affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You've argued that Russia and China are part of what you call a coalescing autocratic axis at the heart of Eurasia. That does not sound reassuring.
No, and it probably shouldn't. I think for a long time, Americans thought about Russia and China as two distinct challenges, and in many ways they are. But one of the things that we've seen before and during this crisis is that they increasingly act together, or at least in parallel, in important ways. And so the Chinese have certainly shrugged off any effort to get them to put pressure on Russia to end the war, but they have also given the appearance of support for Russia's war in many cases. So the problem that we confront today is one in which our two greatest autocratic rivals increasingly work together.
And is that the overriding mutual interest they have in policy at the moment, to be able to hold the United States responsible for everything?
They have two overriding mutual interests. The first is that both would be classified as countries that want to change the existing international system because they think it is unfairly slanted against them. It denies them spheres of influence, for instance, and they see the United States as the primary obstacle to that objective. The second mutual interest is more ideological. Both of these countries are increasingly personalistic autocracies in a world that is led by a democratic superpower, and so they would very much like to create an international system that is more protective of autocracies like their own.
What do you think this suggests to the U.S. now as it confronts Russia's actions in Ukraine?
Well, there's long been a debate in the United States over whether we should prioritize competing with Russia or China or treat them as co-equals, and that debate has flared up again in the context of this war. I think what the war indicates, though, is that the best way of putting pressure on China, which is the more dangerous and the more powerful of the two rivals, is actually to ensure that Russia is defeated, that it does not achieve its objectives in this war, because that will result in a weaker Russia, one that is less capable of putting pressure on the United States and its allies in Europe, and thus less useful as a strategic partner for Beijing.
Whatever happened to the idea that forging close commercial ties with China would bring China closer to a democratic system?
We tried that for about 25 years, but I think we basically underestimated the tenacity and the ruthlessness of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP understood that the policy of economic engagement was ultimately meant to lead to the liberalization of the Chinese political system, and that, of course, was not what the CCP wanted. And so the Chinese Communist Party essentially used the wealth that China was able to accrue through its insertion in the international economy to buy off the Chinese populace to a certain degree, to invest in its own repressive capabilities, and to undertake one of the largest peacetime military buildups in the modern era.
In your judgment, what's the best option for the United States now?
The United States simply can't avoid the reality that it has to contain both Russia and China simultaneously. And if the United States were to try to buy one or both of them off, it would simply weaken its own position. That's a tall order, but it's not impossible. If you add up the United States and its allies in Europe and its allies in the Indo-Pacific, they dramatically outstrip Russia and China together when it comes to military power, economic power, diplomatic power, you name it. And I think that there is also a prospect that putting pressure on Russia can, over the long term, lead to a fraying of the relationship with China. As Russia becomes more dependent on China as a result of this war, it will become less and less comfortable with that dependency. And so this won't make a huge difference over a 2 to 3 year period, but over a 10-year period, perhaps.
Hal Brands is the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Last weekend we told you about the Flea Club, an apparel store in Chicago that had been robbed 4 times in 2 years, and that made it impossible for the owners to buy store insurance. But just hours after we interviewed the owners, Flea Club got robbed again.
It was usually around like 3 in the morning. This time it was like 5:50 a.m. I got an alert from my ADT system. I looked on my cameras and my clothing racks turned over. People running around in my shop. It's just a bad thing every time I see it.
Darius Kelly runs the store with his longtime friend, Sabrine Sledge. Security footage shows a team of thieves breaking through glass and metal shutters, then loading up an SUV with armfuls of jeans, designer jackets, and high-end sneakers. Mr. Kelly estimates they took close to $70,000. The club stayed open after the previous 4 robberies. Not this time.
Oh, it's closed. It's closed, yeah. It's just too much.
He says the last few years have been rough in his hometown.
It's been something like I haven't seen, you know? It's just been a different Chicago. All the break-ins, all the carjackings, all the robberies. It seems like people are just living lawless.
Chicago Police Department says murders are down compared to last year, but burglaries, robberies, theft, and car theft have all increased a lot. Now, merchandise has been recovered, and Darius Kelly says he doesn't know of anyone who's been arrested for any of the break-ins at his store. He'd like to see more police on the streets and tougher penalties for thieves who get caught. For now,
I'm really at a standstill. I really don't know what to do. I'm processing things. I'm trying to get my money together. I just probably want to leave Chicago, go to a different city, try to start over. I put a lot into my business, so I know it's not gonna happen overnight, but I don't think I can deal with this. It's getting in my psyche.
He's raising money on a GoFundMe page and thinks he might move south, maybe to Texas, open a new store there.
You know, I love what I do. I love getting people their shoes, getting people fly, getting people their nice clothes, stuff like that. It's just kind of hard right now, just determining my next move.
Darius Kelly, co-owner of Chicago's Flea Club, which is now closed. And you're listening to NPR News.
You're listening to Alaska Public Media on KSKA Anchorage, FM 91.1, connecting Alaskans, life informed.
In
early 90s, money in Russia became pretty much worthless. So people got creative.
And it pulls me to the window.
In order to store value in other ways.
And across the yard is just a pile of bricks. He says, that's all my savings.
Then, how Wayne Edey built the shoe brand Innovate. That's coming up on the next How I Built This in Planet Money.
Saturdays at 2 p.m. here on Alaska Public Media, FM 91.1.
Many thanks to Alaska Public Media visionary Ray Hancock, whose strong financial support helps meet the news and programming needs of our state in an ever-changing media landscape. Thank you.
I'm Windsor Johnston with these headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the missile strike on an eastern train station that killed at least 50 people is another Russian war crime. During his nightly video address on Friday, Zelensky said great efforts will be taken to make sure those behind the attack will be held responsible. The governor of Kentucky has vetoed a Republican-backed measure to ban abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. The bill would also regulate the dispensing of abortion pills. Jury deliberations are underway for a former Virginia police officer charged in the January 6th insurrection. Attorneys for Thomas Robertson are encouraging the jury to convict him of misdemeanor offenses instead of felony charges. I'm Windsor Johnston, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Mathnasium, committed to boosting students' confidence, critical thinking, and math grades and scores with in-person or online instruction. Each student follows a customized learning plan. More at mathnasium.com. And from Culligan Water, since 1936. A local Culligan specialist can provide in-home water tests and custom recommendations to treat the unique attributes of a home's water. More at Culligan.com.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon. President of Yemen, Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi, stepped down this week in an effort to end a bitter 7-year civil war. He transferred his power to a presidential council on Thursday that will replace his decade-long reign. Yemen's been embroiled in what's basically a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, with Iran-backed Houthi rebels fighting the Saudi-led coalition there. More than 14,000 civilians have been killed in the war, which has set off one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Nadwa al-Dosari is a Yemeni analyst and non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute who joins us. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Scott, for having me.
How significant do you find this transfer of power by the president of Yemen?
It's very significant, and it came as a surprise to many of us Yemenis.
Could it lead to an end of violence and maybe the civil war?
That's a far-fetched assumption. In reality, this has been a Saudi UAE arrangement imposed on Yemenis. None of the participants in the Riyadh conference knew about it. Even members of the Presidential Council did not know that they were selected, and even Hadi did not know until that night. He was practically forced to transfer his powers, which is not a bad thing. Hadi was an extremely incompetent and corrupt leader, and because of his lack of leadership, we've been in a political and military stalemate. Having said that, there are two sets of challenges. One, the Houthis do not recognize the council. They never recognized Hadi. They basically called the council a recycle of Saudi mercenaries. The Houthis are not interested in ending the violence, and that's one of the major problems that will face this council and any efforts to reach peace. On the other hand, also, members of the council, there are 8. They come from different backgrounds. They have different objectives. So it will be challenging to bring them together to agree on issues, and they will have to agree on major issues. Yeah. These members have been handpicked by the Saudis and the Emiratis, so they will be more accountable to their regional backers more than the Yemeni people. What happens when they disagree is Yemen going to become even a platform for proxy war between the Saudis and the Emiratis, and how that will manifest in Yemen. So I think it's too early to be optimistic.
U.S., of course, is a major supplier of weapons to Saudi Arabia, which has fueled the violence in the war. Does the United States have a role now?
The problem with the U.S. are two things. The U.S. is selling weapons to the Saudis and the Emiratis unconditionally. The U.S. should have put conditions on selling the weapons, not only on, that these weapons should not be used to harm civilians, but also that there should have been a clear plan by the Saudis and the Emiratis about their military intervention in Yemen. The second problem with the U.S. role is that the U.S. does not have leverage on the Houthis. And that's a problem because the Houthis are the main obstacle to peaceful negotiations.
Do you see any event occurring over the next few weeks or development that could let us know if the new coalition, as the Presidential Council, is working out?
There's been some rumors that there's been some back channel agreements between the Houthis and the Saudis. I wouldn't be surprised if it happens because clearly the Saudis are very desperate to leave Yemen and their role in the country. They just want the cross-border attacks to stop. So we might see something like that. We might not see something like that. So that's something to watch for.
Nadwa al-Basari is a Yemeni analyst and non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
The United Nations voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council this week. While many countries supported the suspension, plenty didn't. Later today, in All Things Considered, find out why more than 50 countries decided to abstain from voting. You can tune in by telling your smart speaker to play NPR or your member station by name. There's fresh scrutiny on Hunter Biden, the president's son, as he is under investigation. Part of that investigation appears to center on emails that showed up on a notorious laptop that was publicized before the 2020 election and then dismissed by much of the news media. Many of these emails have now been authenticated. NPR's David Folkenflik joins us now. David, thanks so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
And what have we learned so far?
We've learned a bunch more detail about Hunter Biden's vision to help a Ukrainian natural gas company called Burisma handle bad press in the U.S. and some other ramifications here, although he didn't register as a lobbyist. We also learned about a Chinese energy company, presumably with links to the Chinese Communist government, that made Hunter Biden 7 figures in a short amount of time. To be clear, Hunter Biden has not been charged with any wrongdoing on this. He's said in the past that he's done stupid things, but nothing illegal.
How did that information surface?
Mostly through new reporting. You got to start with revelations in a book last fall by Politico's Ben Schreckinger, and more recently in articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Much of these reports appear to center on materials related to the federal investigation of Hunter Biden. And there are a lot of witnesses and a lot of lawyers who've been asked about some of those Hunter Biden emails and correspondence and documents between him and some of his associates.
The New York Post broke this story just weeks before the 2020 election. Remind us of what ensued then.
So the New York Post presented this story as a bombshell, and it said the emails were a smoking gun showing effectively Hunter Biden's corruption and suggesting much the same about candidate Joe Biden. Yet its scoops were based on emails that could not at the time be independently authenticated on a laptop that had not been positively identified as belonging to Hunter Biden, which was said to be abandoned at a repair shop. The laptop was provided, it's worth remembering, by President Trump's personal attorney Rudy Giuliani to the New York Post. That's a tabloid owned by Rupert Murdoch, a political ally of Donald Trump. And I think it's also worth noting Murdoch's Wall Street Journal and Fox News had reporters who had the same material. They passed on the story, concerned about how authentic it might be.
Are conservative critics of the president correct, though, in saying that in retrospect the media was just too deferential to the Bidens?
Maybe. I do think you have to understand the context of the moment. Think of what happened in 2016. You had the Russian involvement in leaking of hacked emails from Hillary Clinton and the Democrats, and that caused incredible havoc during the election season. And think, too, a bit later of the so-called Steele dossier that attracted a ton of press coverage. It was posted in full by BuzzFeed News, and it turned out they contained a lot of misinformation, not about Hillary Clinton, the Democrats, but about the conduct of Donald Trump.
Does that let off the media too easily? You wrote at the time that the mainstream press was right to be wary of the reporting of the New York Post.
And I still think so. I don't think it lets them off too easily. I do think, though, there are 2 important points I want to make here. first, let's acknowledge social media's role. A number of platforms tamped down on sharing of the Post story. In the case of Twitter, not only did they try to block sharing of it, they suspended the New York Post's actual Twitter account for sharing its own article. That was a wild overreach, and even Twitter had to acknowledge that. And then there was this cohort of paid pundits, 50 former national security officials, many of them appearing frequently in mainstream media outlets, who came together for a statement saying that this surfacing of the laptop bore all the hallmarks of a Russian misinformation campaign, and they pointed to Russia's hacking of emails back in 2016, and their claims were not sufficiently and rigorously enough tested and questioned. I will go back to what I wrote at the time. None of the criticism from conservatives to do this seeming expose on Hunter Biden should force reporters to accept the New York Post's claims as true without additional reporting and additional verification.
And there are now Republicans and conservatives who say what we do know now, in their mind, demonstrates corruption by a sitting president.
You know, from the evidence we have now, and that's important to note, the timing, President Joe Biden's actions have not been shown to be corrupt. What has been shown is a seeming tolerance for close family members, Hunter Biden, the president's brother, who are willing to trade on the family name in a way that seems, if not corrupt, untoward. And there's now more heft to a storyline that we already knew a lot about, and yet remains one we're still pursuing.
NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik, thanks so much.
You bet.
Cow is a film that's almost wordless, but still eloquent, often painfully so. Shows mothers crying out for their children, snorting in frustration and often looking dull-eyed and lonely. Cow is the first documentary from Andrea Arnold, who has directed the feature films Red Road and American Honey. She joins us now. Ms. Arnold, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
This cow does have a name, Luma. Why did you decide to try to tell her story?
I think this goes back for quite a long time. I had a very close relationship with nature growing up. A very sort of wild relationship with nature because I lived on a housing estate and had very young parents, so they just let me roam. And then as I got older, I kind of, moved to the city. That sort of slipped away a bit, and I always wanted to do something that kind of put me on the other side of the fence, if you like, because I'm always seeing cows outside the window on the train, and I thought, well, I wonder what it's like to be in the field, rather than looking at the cows.
Did the farm owner seem to know how some of these scenes would look to the public?
I mean, the thing is, when we started the film, I didn't really know what the film was going to be honest. But we always were very straight with the farmers and told them what we were doing, that we were filming the cow's experience. And they could very clearly see that because we were always with the cow and filming the cow. So we were very straight with them and showed them things as we went along as well, and actually went to show them the film at the end of the process. For them, it was kind of interesting because they're watching something that they have spent their entire lives doing. So actually, one of them, after about 10 minutes, said, well, I'm not bored. I thought I was going to be really bored because, he was watching something that he was very used to.
The first truly wrenching moment comes about 15 minutes into Cow. Luma's calf is taken from her. Her delight in being close to her child is suddenly and forcefully shut down. She seems to cry out for her calf. What do you say to people, including some farmers, who say, look, they work with and they care about animals, and some of us are just anthropomorphizing by imputing human characteristics onto an animal when we see a scene like this?
I think that argument has been going on for a long time, isn't it, about what animals are actually, how do we know what animals are actually feeling? You don't actually know. But we don't know what another human being is feeling. But I know she has aliveness, I know she has consciousness, and we're very used to using animals for their meat and their bones and all the things that they, we use them for. But what about their consciousness? What about this thing that we have, which is feelings, thoughts, desires? What about that invisible side of ourselves, which you might call the soul or whatever you want to call it? But they have that too. So you can imagine what's going on.
I mean, we should be clear, we don't see a moment of conspicuous personal cruelty, but several times we see her separated suddenly from calves in the course of the film.
But that's dairy farming.
Yeah.
She's just one cow, but that is, for the large part, most industrial dairy farming involves, we don't get the milk without the cow providing the milk. And in order to do that, the easiest thing is to separate the mother and the calf, because we're going to be taking the milk.
I was so engrossed in the film I wasn't timing exactly, but it seemed to me we're an hour into the film before we see a real patch of grass. Most of the time in this film we see them in the stalls, concrete, wire, lack of sunlight. Doesn't look like the kind of farm you see in a children's book.
The thing is, the reality is we are all quite disconnected from the reality, aren't we? That's the sad thing, I think, because we have plenty of fantasies of animals growing up. We have picture books, and we have fluffy cow toys and fluffy pig toys, and we use imagery of animals in fantastical ways everywhere, but actually the reality is a little tougher.
Andrea Arnold, her new film, Cow, is in select theaters and on demand from IFC Films. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And you're listening to Weekend Edition from NPR News. Pakistan has been in a political crisis for nearly a week now, ever since the Prime Minister moved to dissolve Parliament and accused the opposition of helping to carry out what he called an American plot to overthrow his rule. The Supreme Court ruled this was unconstitutional and ruled Parliament should reconvene and hold that no-confidence vote. NPR's Dia Hadid joins us from Islamabad. Dia, thanks so much for being with us.
Hi there, Scott.
And set this up for us, if you can, please. How did all of this come about?
Sure. So analysts here say the military, which is Pakistan's most powerful institution, seemed to withdraw its backing from the government of Prime Minister Imran Khan. The military denies it's involved in politics, but in all cases it was a signal to the opposition that they could try and make a bid for power. Last week they got the numbers to push Khan from his position in a no-confidence motion, but just as that vote was meant to be held, the Prime Minister moved to dissolve Parliament. He said that vote was part of an American plot to overthrow him, and the opposition then appealed to the Supreme Court, which ruled that Parliament had to reconvene. So it's been a pretty dramatic week.
Reconvene to hold that vote of no confidence. So what happened today?
Right, so we raced to Parliament, and we found lawmakers hanging out. They were waiting for the Speaker to arrive. One legislator brought Sharpies and cardboard and was making signs alluding to the opposition being traitors. It seems like Khan's MPs were basically buying time to delay the vote. Just as we left, the Foreign Minister began speaking. Now we've just learnt that the Prime Minister will convene an emergency meeting of his cabinet this evening. So it looks like the vote won't happen until tomorrow, if it happens at all.
If it happens at all. Well, if the opposition has the votes for a no-confidence vote, is it possible just to go to elections?
Well, yes and no. The Prime Minister and his allies do want to go to early elections. They want a fresh mandate. And have a listen here to the Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi.
The only way to protect Pakistan from the constitutional crisis is to seek a fresh mandate from the people of Pakistan.
But it seems they don't want a no-confidence vote because they want to leave on a high.
The opposition wants elections also, right?
Yes, but here's the interesting thing, and I think it's pretty understandable to people who live in a democracy. They say they want a few months to reform the electoral rules. They want to shut down avenues which they say the military has used to intervene in the voting in the past. Remember, the military denies any intervention like this. They say some districts need to be delineated. They're in very remote areas near the Afghan border. But their big concern is electronic voting booths. Khan's government said they could be used in the next election. But have a listen to Nafisa Shah. She is an opposition lawmaker from the PPP party.
There was a genuine fear that this regime would use this forcibly passed law where they were going to bring in these machines to vote. There was a fear that this would lead to rigging. So there was a consensus among the opposition that we must take power so as to do some course correction.
Now, interestingly, Pakistan runs one of the world's biggest biometric databases, so electronic voting is actually more possible here than it is in other countries. But it has a lot of implications for privacy laws and access to a citizen's voting record.
NPR's Dia Hadid in Islamabad. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Scott, for making time.
This is NPR News.
Hi, this is Kathleen McCoy, host of Hometown Alaska. You're listening to Alaska Public Media on KSKA Anchorage, FM 91.1, connecting Alaskans, life informed.
Alaskans, help grow a better tomorrow for Alaska's children. April is Child Abuse Prevention Month, and Alaskans everywhere can help protect children and youth. From spending time with a child to offering a helping hand to a parent, growing positive childhood experiences starts with each Alaskan. Positive childhood experiences help with physical and mental health for years to come. Learn more about child abuse prevention and how to help at alaskachildrenstrust.org or on Facebook. This message sponsored by Alaska Children's Trust.
I'm Windsor Johnston with these headlines. The president of Ukraine is calling the missile strike on a train station in the eastern part of the country a deliberate attack on civilians. At least 50 people were killed. In his latest video address, Volodymyr Zelensky called the strike another Russian war crime. French voters will go to the polls on Sunday for the first round of a presidential election. Polls show a tightening gap between the two frontrunners, incumbent President Emmanuel Macron and far-right candidate Marine Le Pen. Civil rights groups say they plan to file a lawsuit against a new law in Alabama that targets transgender youth. Alabama is one of more than a dozen Republican-led states that have passed bills restricting LGBTQ rights. I'm Windsor Johnston, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Ooma, a cloud-based phone service for businesses of any size that comes with an automated virtual receptionist, video meetings, and mobility features to connect to customers and coworkers anywhere. More at ooma.com. And from Morgan Stanley with their podcast, Thoughts on the Market, offering concise takes on current events and their implications for financial markets. 3 minutes an episode, 5 times a week. Thoughts on the Market.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon, and now it's time for sports. Baseball's back. Cubs undefeated so far, 1-1 rain out, home stretch in the NBA, and Tiger Woods. Howard Bryant from Meadowlark Media joins us. Howard, thanks so much for being with us.
Good morning, Scott. Are you excited?
Yeah, I am excited. I always am about the start debate, but I tell you what. So I looked over all the preseason predictions. As near as I can tell, the Los Angeles Dodgers have, with the exception of Shohei Ohtani, have accumulated every big name player in the game since Honus Wagner was on the field.
It is true. It is true. And they are a machine. They're a juggernaut and the whole thing. And I asked if you were interested and excited because it does feel, opening day sort of snuck up on me because of the lockout and because the Red Sox and Yankees got rained out. And then I was watching the world champion Braves playing the Reds the other night. And I was like, wait a minute, it's the regular season. These games actually count. So it is good that the games have started and the bitterness of the labor situation seems to be behind. And it seems like the fans are going to be are interested in it, and so we'll see what happens. But I think people are very happy that the summer game is back.
And I think the White Sox are looking good. I'll say that, okay?
White Sox are very good. People are expecting the White Sox to be very good, and they're expecting the Toronto Blue Jays to be very good, and they're expecting the Dodgers to run away with it, but people in San Francisco are saying, wait a minute, our team won 107 games last year, don't forget about us. And then down in Atlanta, they're saying, well, we won the World Series, so there's a whole bunch of excitement across the board for everybody. I'm actually really looking forward to seeing what a bunch of teams do, including, I really like Toronto, I really like what San Francisco did. Interested in seeing what Bob Melvin and San Diego do this year, even though their superstar Fernando Tatis is going to be out because busted his wrist riding his motorcycle.
Oh, that'll happen. NBA playoffs, LeBron and the Lakers are out.
Out.
They're the deer! They're looking pretty good, aren't they?
Waiting to hear that from you, Scott. It's been a while because I think that people have sort of let the Bucks go under the radar. They were good this year. They weren't great. They didn't blow everybody away. You've got a huge glut of teams at the top of the East. You've got Philadelphia, and you've got Miami, and you've got Milwaukee and Boston, the suddenly very, very good Boston Celtics. But the champs are still the champs, and until somebody beats them, I think they're the favorites, even though the best team in the NBA this year, by far, has been the team that Milwaukee beat in the finals, the Phoenix Suns.
And of course, Tiger Woods, back from a car accident just over a year ago. He's playing in the Masters tournament this week. I confess we have, a monitor tuned to ESPN on in the studio. I think he's 9 strokes back. What do you make of this?
Well, I think the victory of Tiger is that he's there in the first place. I think that this is a story. I don't think anyone expected Tiger Woods to come back. When you go back and at least for this tournament, I think when you go and you look at the wreckage of that accident he had last year, you didn't know if he was ever going to be able to play at the highest level again. And I think that Tiger is one of those athletes, one of those really, really special athletes that whenever he's in the field, you're doing 2 things. You're watching the game, but you're also watching him. And that always brings a special element to the tournament. And making the cut through all 4 rounds would be pretty spectacular as well. Good comeback story, no matter what he does.
Howard Bryant, thanks so much. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Scott.
An exhibit on display now in Connecticut showcases the work of Adger Cowens, a black photographer and painter whose subjects range from civil rights marches to Hollywood movie sets. Connecticut Public Radio's Ryan Karen King brings us to Cowan's studio, where the artist reflects on his life's work.
Adger Cowens shuffles through a stack of prints. Sketches, collages, and paintings cover almost every surface in his studio.
Let me see, what else?
There's a photo of Sarah Vaughan performing at the Newport Jazz Fest, and a picture of Mick Jagger relaxing in a hammock. Cowens pulls out a photo of a small girl silhouetted against the piercing beams of the sun. She looks like she's falling towards the ground.
This is Icarus. They were throwing a little girl up with a blanket on the beach, and I had just gotten a 21mm lens, and I got real close to the edge of the blanket, and I shot this picture, and it reminded me of Icarus.
That's after the Greek mythological figure who flew too close to the sun. Cowens, who's 85, was one of the first black students to earn a degree in photography from Ohio University in the late 1950s. He says growing up, he often listened to what the older men around him were talking about.
I was a news carrier. I was a paper boy. So I was reading the papers while I was carrying, so I was pretty up on what was going on in the world. And the things that, upset me was like racism. It still upsets me about black people getting hung and killed and shot. It got me. It gets me today.
Cowens says he faced a lot of racism working in a predominantly white industry. He got his big break when celebrated photojournalist Gordon Parks, who was the first black staff photographer at Life magazine, hired Cowens as his assistant.
So I took all of that racism and rejection and everything, and I put it in my work. That's one of the big things I learned from Gordon Parks, was to take negative energy and turn it into positive power.
Cowens was also the first black still photographer in Hollywood, working with directors like Spike Lee and Francis Ford Coppola. He didn't let the movie stars faze him. He wanted to get to know the people he photographed.
I wanted those moments of life flowing past me, whether it was movie stars, whether it was people walking down the street, whether it was an abstract, no matter what it was. If I had a feeling here in my heart, then it was important to me to do it.
Halima Taha is the curator for Callan's new exhibition at the Fairfield University Art Museum in Connecticut. She says she poured through hundreds of his images to select the right ones with him for the gallery. Some pictures that have been published before and many that hadn't.
One of the things that happens to many artists, and particularly artists of African descent, is that the same images keep being reproduced or exhibited because people are familiar with them.
Taha says Callan's got a lot of support from his family and community growing up in Columbus, Ohio, and it gave him the conviction and confidence to handle the prejudice he faced later.
I think that because he came out of that kind of environment, he was able to focus on developing himself as a human being, as a visual artist, and in particular as a photographer.
Back in his studio, Callan's is painting. That's what he spends most of his time doing now, and he's not thinking of stopping anytime soon. He says he didn't put out a book of his photography until he was 80.
People say, well, what do you want your legacy to be? I don't know anything about a legacy. You know, it'll be what it is. It'll be what the people make it. I can't make my legacy. I don't even know what that is. All I want to do is the work, and it'll be whatever it be.
For NPR News, I'm Ryan Karen King.
Love and loss are levelers. No one can avoid loss, and we all crave love, even as it can make losses harder to bear. Delia Ephron has written a memoir that takes us through a short time in her life in which she was rocked by the loss of several loved ones, welcomed a new love into her life, and then was struck by a disease that lurked within her family line. Her book is Left on 10th, and Delia Ephron, the author of many screenplays, including You've Got Mail, essays, novels, and a play with her late sister Nora, joins us now from Manhattan. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
I find it daunting to try and explain what you went through in that short period. Great writer of dialogue that you are, Delia Ephron. Have you perfected a concise line to explain what happened?
Life gave me a story so big that I simply had to write it. But one of the things about this story is that it contains so much luck, good and bad, that it made me wonder about things like miracles. It's also about friendship, because I was carried through. So I'm really owe my existence now to love and medicine.
Yeah. The book opens with an awful moment in which you had promised Jerry, your beloved, I guess we say first husband now, who was fatally ill, that he could die at home. But then there's almost a wrestling match for you to try and make that possible.
I was told that if I got all the documents, the DNR and the healthcare proxy, that if he fell or something, I could just call up the EMTs and they would come over and I would say, you know, please put my husband back in bed.
Yeah, DNR is do not resuscitate.
Yeah, do not resuscitate. So I call 911 and 5 EMTs show up in my apartment. And I'm thinking, all I want you to do is just pick up my husband and put him back in bed. And they said no. They were going to take him to the hospital. And he was so ill. He had pneumonia. I knew that he had, at most, 48 hours, maybe less. So it was madness. And finally, I just started crying. And he died later on at about 3 in the morning. And I went into the room. I just said, I think he's dead. I mean, just so bluntly, like they'd beaten me into bluntness, you know? But it left me with a lot of trauma. And I felt a lot of guilt. I think people do feel guilty after their mates die, that they haven't done every possible thing they could do. I mean, how could you really?
Yeah. You wound up writing an essay about how difficult it was for Verizon to change their phone service, your phone service, after your husband's death.
Yes.
Which, the effect of that essay, which ran in the New York Times, was to introduce you to the man, Peter, who would be your second husband. I'm sorry, it's like You've Got Mail.
It was like I fell into my own romantic comedy. I simply couldn't believe it. I got this email from Peter, and it was 2 months after I'd been invited to speak at a conference of Jungians, and I said to myself, what's a Jungian? I better meet one and find out. And Peter writes me, I'm a Jungian analyst, a psychiatrist. I thought, this is so spooky. Also, my sister had fixed us up 54 years before. I did not remember him at all. But he did come blessed by my sister. So we started to write, and it was, well, all the emails are in the book. It was an amazing connection between us. And when I started to write the book, I looked at them and I thought, well, I have to include them.
What's it like to be told almost as soon as you had regained some emotional footing in life that your own health was now in jeopardy?
I was dealing with so much grief, and falling in love was like this beautiful magic that descended. And there's nothing like falling in love. And then to walk into that hospital for a routine checkup and just, I remember I just said to the PA who was looking at I said, I come every 6 months, my blood's always fine. And he said, it's not fine. And, you know, everything started spinning. And I knew that day I had leukemia.
Your sister Nora, at one point contending with same disease, had refused a bone marrow transplant. You made another choice, although you were told the odds were just 20%.
First of all, I did have the opportunity to have a different kind of transplant that didn't exist even when Nora was sick. Neither of us had a match. Okay, and what you want with a bone marrow transplant, you want a perfect match, and neither Nora nor I had one. But I had the opportunity to have this thing called a haplocord transplant, which is a donation from 2 donors. One is an adult donor, and one is from the stem cells of cord blood that a mother donates when she gives birth. And those are the stem cells that ultimately take over your marrow, and they're very adaptable in a way that the adult marrow might not be. So if you don't have a match, it's rather fantastic. And it didn't exist 5 years ago. It didn't exist for Nora. I mean, I don't know if she would have done that. We were very different. And
But still, 20% is...
It was low. Well, first of all, Dr. Robos, my amazing leukemia doctor, called me up and she said, you're not a statistic. I mean, she believed I should do it. And she then said to me, don't be scared of the treatment, be scared of leukemia. So she just shifted the focus of my fear in a very brilliant way.
Your blood type is different.
Yes, isn't that amazing? I didn't even realize that.
That's because of the transplants, right?
Right, it just, I mean, one day Peter was looking at some record of something. He said, oh, my gosh, you have type A blood. I've always had type O blood. I mean, it was, of course, you only have one blood type. You're born with it, and now I have a completely different one.
So what else is different about Julia Efron now, do you think?
Part of what was so hard about being so sick was that I think writing is a calling, and it's a place where I'm happiest. And I thought I'd lost it when I was trying to get well. I just thought, I'm never going to write again, you know. And now I have that happiness again in my life. I'm able to, you know, I was able to write this book. And I do want to say, because there's so much trauma associated with trying to get well from a terribly serious illness, that if you can do anything with it, if you can write it, draw it, paint it, dance it, do something with it, it will help you get not totally through. I think there's always residual, but it will really help you heal.
I feel the need to ask this question after all you've been through and survived. What's really important in life?
Well, love. No question about it.
Julia Efron, her memoir, Left on 10th. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Scott.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Easy Cater, committed to solving food for today's workplaces, from sales meetings to employee lunches. Online ordering from more than 80,000 restaurants. Corporate food solutions at easycater.com. And from Data IQ, a platform for everyday AI to help organizations make AI part of their daily business, designed to elevate people, teams, and companies. DATAIKU.com.
Hi, this is Lori Townsend, News Director and host of Talk of Alaska. You're listening to Alaska Public Media on KSKA Anchorage, FM 91.1, connecting Alaskans, life informed.
This week in This American Life, we take you to Hungary, where political parties that normally hate each other's guts banded together to try to defeat somebody they saw as a dictator, Prime Minister Viktor Orban. If you picture AOC joining forces with Mitt Romney, you basically get the idea. Behind the scenes, as their Hail Mary pass to save democracy in their country. This week.
Saturday at noon on Alaska Public Media, FM 91.1, or tell your smart speaker to play KSKA.
It's an expensive cycle. Insurance, gas, maintenance. Let us help break it by turning that car of yours into public radio. If your car is more worth than it's useful, donate it to us. We'll pick it up, get top dollar for it, and use the funds to bring you more of your favorite shows. You might even qualify for a tax deduction.
Go to alaskapublic.org/vehicle today.
From NPR News in Washington, D.C., this is Weekend Edition. I'm Scott Simon. The latest from Ukraine this hour. Ron Elving on the week of history for the Supreme Court. And later, Kira and Lena Manevich, two sisters in a Ukrainian family that's been separated by the Russian invasion.
I know every time when there are sirens in my home city, so I text them all the time, how are you? Is everything fine? That's really hard.
That story this hour, and later, Colin Tobin on his new Lifetime collection of poetry, and Kay Tempest with her new spoken word songs that complete a circle from gloom to grace. First, we have our newscast. Today is Saturday, April 9, 2022.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Winter Johnston. Ukrainian officials are calling yesterday's missile strike on a train station in the eastern part of the country another war crime carried out by Russia. NPR's Nathan Rott reports the station was crowded with civilians trying to flee the region. More than 50 people died.
Regional officials in eastern Ukraine and national figures, including the Ukrainian defense minister, have been urging residents of eastern Ukraine who have not fled the area to do so while they still can. Russia is expected to launch another heavy offensive in the eastern part of the country and around the besieged city of Mariupol on the country's southern coast. Near the capital and in northern Ukraine, police and investigative teams are clearing areas recently occupied by Russians of mines and unexploded ordnance. They're also documenting evidence of potential war crimes. Nathan Rott, NPR News, Kyiv.
An engineer at Chernobyl's former nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine told the BBC when the station's power supply was cut off for 3 days, he had to scramble to find fuel to keep the generator running, even resorting to stealing some from the Russians. Alexander Levada is a radiation safety supervisor at Chernobyl.
We store nuclear waste. If we'd lost power, it would have been catastrophic. Radioactive material could have been released. I wasn't really worried for my life. I was scared of what would happen if I wasn't here.
Chernobyl is not a working power station, but radioactive waste is still stored at the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster. If conditions at the facility are not maintained properly, there's a major risk of release of nuclear material. The Justice Department earlier this week disrupted a Russian military cyber operation. Now the private sector is taking action. NPR's Jenna McLaughlin reports on a plan from Microsoft to prevent some Russian cyber attacks in Ukraine, as well as the United States.
Microsoft is working with U.S. courts to take some Russian military cyber operations offline. In this case, Microsoft witnessed a Russian cyber actor called Strontium using specific internet domains to launch digital attacks against Ukrainian targets. The company asked a court for permission, then seized those domains to prevent their misuse. The Russian group, according to Microsoft, was targeting Ukrainian organizations, but also think tanks and government agencies in the United States and Europe, to hack into their systems and steal information. Over time, Microsoft has seized over 100 domains used by Russian military intelligence. According to the company, this is just a small part of Russia's malicious cyber activity. Jenna McLaughlin, NPR News.
This is NPR. The crew of an all-civilian mission to the International Space Station has arrived at the orbiting lab a little less than a day after launching from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Brendan Byrne from member station WMFE in Orlando has more.
The 4-member crew's docking was delayed by about an hour due to an issue with one of the video feeds used to help. Technicians were able to find a workaround, and now SpaceX's Crew Dragon capsule is firmly attached to the ISS. The crew became the first all-private crew to fly to the station, a mission chartered by Houston-based company Axiom. The mission's commander, an Axiom employee, is a former NASA astronaut and has been to the station before. The other 3 paid roughly $55 million each for the 8-day stay. But it's not just a joyride. Axiom says the crew will perform dozens of science experiments while on board, mainly aimed at looking at the physical effects of spaceflight on the human body. For NPR News, I'm Brendan Byrne in Orlando.
Jury deliberations are expected to continue on Monday in the case against a former Virginia police officer charged in the attack on the U.S. Capitol building. The jury in the trial of Thomas Robertson deliberated for several hours on Friday without reaching a verdict. His attorneys conceded that Robertson broke the law when he entered the Capitol while armed, but they're urging the jurors to convict him of misdemeanor offenses instead of felony charges. According to the Justice Department, more than 700 people have so far been arrested in connection with the Capitol riot. I'm Windsor Johnston, and you're listening to NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Capital One, offering Capital One Shopping, a downloadable browser extension that searches various sites for shoppers. What's in your wallet? More at CapitalOneShopping.com. And the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
Hi, this is Dr. Jillian Woodruff, host of Line 1, Your Health Connection. You're listening to Alaska Public Media on KSKA Anchorage, FM 91.1.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon. Thank you for joining us today. Russia's again being accused of war crimes after a missile attack struck a train station in eastern Ukraine. It was crowded with civilians who were trying to escape the conflict. At least 52 people were killed. About 100 are being treated at hospitals. NPR's Ada Peralta is in Kiev, and we should caution you, our report contains some painfully graphic descriptions. Ada, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Scott.
What more are we learning about this attack?
So we know that a missile hit a train station in the town of Kramatorsk at about 10 a.m. yesterday, and this happened when there were thousands of people trying to evacuate. So as you said, 52 people are dead. Among them were 5 children, and the images that are coming out of there are horrific. On the outside of the station, we're seeing lifeless bodies surrounded by all the luggage that was left behind as people fled, and Near the platforms, rescue workers are recovering body parts. The Ukrainian government says this was a Russian missile strike. The Russians deny it, but the Ukrainians say that this fits a pattern, that the Russians are trying to terrorize Ukrainians by launching these types of attacks that target areas full of civilians.
And what has the leadership of Ukraine, and for that matter some world leaders, said about the attack?
President Zelensky is calling this a war crime. And yesterday, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, was here in Kyiv, and she visited a mass grave just north of here. It's a town where buildings were flattened and bodies were strewn along the streets. And she said that after what she saw, it was clear that humanity had been shattered. And she said that this was a conflict about big ideas. Let's listen.
Will heinous devastation be winning, or will it be humanity that is prevailing? Or will the right of might be the rule, or will it be the rule of law? And this is what is at stake in this war.
The EU did impose more sanctions on Russia, and yesterday the United Nations voted to kick Russia out of the Human Rights Council.
Ada, why was this particular station so busy? And are people still being encouraged to leave, knowing that represents some risk?
Yeah, look, what's happening here is that the Ukrainian government believes that the Russian troops that have retreated from the capital region are regrouping in Belarus, and the Ukrainian government says that sometime in the near future they will begin attacking in the east. So people are trying to get ahead of that, and they're rushing to train stations. And this is one of the important stations in that part of the country. Now, authorities here are saying that civilians should still continue to evacuate, and because the Kramatorsk train station is now inoperable, they have started busing people to another nearby station. I've been talking to people out east, and they say that in the past few days, shelling has intensified. They tell me that they're sleeping in basements because as the sun comes down, the fighting gets worse. And so people, they're taking these warnings seriously. And I think there's a lot of worry that attacks like these can really slow down the process of getting civilians to safety.
And President Peralta in Kyiv, thanks so much.
Thank you, Scott.
A week for history in Washington, D.C. as the Senate confirmed Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to become a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, the first black woman on the nation's highest court.
We have come a long way toward perfecting our union. In my family, it took just one generation to go from segregation to the Supreme Court of the United States.
That was Judge Jackson at the White House yesterday. NPR's Ron Elving joins us. Ron, thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you, Scott.
The confirmation hearings, as I don't have to tell you, were divisive. And so was the vote, 53-47, almost entirely along party lines. Ron, since this confirmation was mathematically assured for a few weeks, why didn't more Republicans, a number of whom had voted to confirm the judge as a district and then appellate court judge, just embrace the moment from history and vote for a confirmation?
We did know last month that all the Democrats would vote for. That meant she'd have at least 50, and Vice President Harris could have broken the tie. But it took a while for those few Republican votes to emerge and make her confirmation somewhat bipartisan. A lot of Republicans had dug in and announced against her. It had become increasingly difficult to say you were going to vote for. It's increasingly difficult to win a primary for the Senate as a Republican in a red state if you vote with a Democratic president for anything, but especially for a Supreme Court nomination. Lately, we've seen much more partisanship in that process. Senators now feel enormous pressure to support or oppose justices for their views or their past decisions on a handful of hot-button issues, principally abortion, of course, but also same-sex marriage and transgender rights and other divisive social issues.
Of course, 3 Republicans did vote to confirm the judge, and I want to ask you about Mitt Romney of Utah, who could be seen prominently standing and applauding in the Senate chamber after the vote on Thursday. What do you make of that moment?
It made a rather entertaining moment on C-SPAN, all the Democrats standing and applauding for an unusually long time after the roll call was announced, while almost all the Republicans were marching off. Romney, however, kept clapping and smiling and looking increasingly lonely on his side of the aisle, At one point, Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, who's been a leading Jackson antagonist, stood up and buttoned his suit jacket and stalked out of the chamber, crossing in front of Mitt Romney, who was still applauding. If you're a Senate junkie, Scott, that's the kind of minor drama moment you live for. But let's remember, Romney was the only Republican senator to vote for Trump to be removed from office in the first impeachment in 2020 and the second in 2021. He was the only one to do it twice. On Justice Jackson, there were the two other votes from the Republican side, from Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Both have been known to vote for abortion rights in the past, setting them apart from their party colleagues.
And there was some agreement, a 100-0 vote to punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. 2 votes, in fact. Tell us about them.
The Maine one stripped Russia of what's called most favored nation trade status. Something of a misnomer, really, because it's normal access, really. It's just average trade status with lower tariffs and fewer other barriers. Taking that away is a big deal, though. It cost a lot of Russians a lot of money. It will cost money for people who use Russian oil and gas and other resources. The second was a ban on imports of Russian oil, which had been paused already. We weren't depending on Russia's oil for much, but it was a part of the mix of our supply, and it was also a model for other countries. So usually when you see that tally of 100-0, you might think it was a meaningless vote, a commemorative, or an apple pie resolution. It's rare to see unanimity on anything of real importance.
Unfortunately, you can answer this next question with one word. Did Congress leave town without a COVID relief package extension?
Unfortunately, yes.
That was 2 words, but that's all. NPR's Ron Elving, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Scott.
Will Vladimir Putin ever stand trial for war crimes? President Biden sounded solemn after he saw images of the killings of Ukrainian civilians by Vladimir Putin's Russian troops in the town of Bucha. Many shot at close range, their hands bound and piled into shallow mass graves. I think it is a war crime, the president told reporters. He should be held accountable. But does any threat of war crimes trials deter Vladimir Putin or his Russian troops from acts of savagery? Dozens more people died just yesterday in a Russian attack on a train station in Kramatorsk. The International Criminal Court has opened a war crimes investigation into Russian actions in Ukraine and can issue arrest warrants. But the idea of Vladimir Putin taking a perp walk out of the Kremlin and put on trial at The Hague, I just don't see this happening. Michael Ignatieff told us this week. He was head of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard, an author, historian, and former leader of Canada's Liberal Party. International criminal tribunals were created by the United Nations to prosecute war crimes. In the Balkans in the early 1990s and Rwanda in 1994, but those trials occurred years after the massacres, mass graves, and genocides. I covered the wars in the Balkans and was back in Sarajevo at a time when there seemed to be daily sightings of Ratko Mladic, the Serb general, and Radovan Karadzic, the first president of Republika Srpska, had been indicted for orchestrating the siege of Sarajevo in the 1995 massacre at Srebrenica, where more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys were executed. Both men evaded capture for more than a decade before being caught and put on trial. Karadzic, one of the authors of the murderous Serb policy called ethnic cleansing, even concocted a new identity, practicing alternative medicine in a Belgrade suburb. Their convictions made plain the outrage of the world, but did putting them on trial for war crimes in Bosnia deter others from committing later atrocities in Syria, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Ethiopia, or Yemen? Does announcing investigations into war crimes truly help those Ukrainians being assaulted every day before the eyes of the world? Just investigating war crimes now, Michael Ignatieff told us, is a diversionary activity, virtue signaling, he said, when Ukrainians need anti-aircraft rockets, MiG aircraft, and tanks, not gestures to survive. And you're listening to NPR News.
Hi, this is reporter Lex Trinan, and you're listening to Alaska Public Media on KSKA Anchorage, FM 91.1, connecting Alaskans, life informed.
Alaska Public Media thanks Leadership Circle advocates Leslie Dean and Don Hopwood, whose generous contributions help provide the critical news coverage and programs Alaskans count on. Thank you.
Alaska Public Media comes from donors like you, and from Tidal Wave Books, a community hub for book lovers planning spring break travel, spring cleaning, and this year's garden. More on Facebook and at wavebooks.com.
I'm Winter Johnston with these headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is urging the European Union to impose a full embargo on Russian oil and gas amid the invasion of Ukraine. Zelensky also says his country's security service has intercepted communications of Russian troops that provide evidence of war crimes. Amazon is seeking to overturn the historic Union victory at one of its New York City warehouses. The online retail giant cited more than 24 objections in a legal filing on Friday. The Idaho Supreme Court has temporarily blocked a new state law that would ban abortion after about 6 weeks of pregnancy. The law was scheduled to take effect later this month. I'm Winter Johnston, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Subaru. In partnership with its retailers and the National Forest Foundation, Subaru helped replant more than 1 million trees in areas devastated by wildfires. Love, it's what makes Subaru, Subaru. And from Indeed, a hiring platform committed to helping businesses of all sizes. Businesses can invite candidates to apply, then schedule and conduct interviews all in one place. More at Indeed.com/NPR.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon. A jury has found 2 of the 4 men accused of plotting to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, not guilty yesterday. The jurors couldn't reach a verdict on charges against the other 2 men. Prosecutors allege the defendants were planning to kidnap the governor and eliminate her security detail in 2020. We're joined now by Rick Pluta, senior Capitol correspondent for the Michigan Public Radio Network. Rick, thanks for being with us.
Oh, you bet. Good morning, Scott.
Please take us back to 2020 and remind us of the allegations in this case.
Sure. A couple of years ago, the FBI caught wind of a plot to kidnap the Democratic governor. The suspects were apparently upset over her COVID-19 restrictions and pandemic orders, and according to the indictment, they decided to do something about it. And it reached the point where investigators said they made plans to kidnap the governor. Prosecutors say they even staked out her vacation home in northern Michigan, and they talked about either putting her on trial or just setting her adrift on a boat in Lake Michigan.
And who were the men accused in this plot?
Their names are Daniel Harris, Daniel Caserta, Adam Fox, and Barry Croft, and they called themselves the Wolverine Watchmen. They were members of a self-styled militia group that practiced paramilitary training. They talked about assaulting the Michigan State Capitol, but they decided that was too risky. So they allegedly settled on a different plan. The plan was this kidnapping plot.
And there were explosives, not only explosive charges, but actual explosives in the charges, weren't there?
Yeah, law enforcement says they put together homemade bombs, ostensibly to blow up a bridge to slow down the police, and they practiced with guns and explosives. In fact, in a secretly taped conversation with an FBI informant, one of the men warns one of his kids to stay away while he builds a bomb.
And how did the defense counter these charges?
Well, the men's defense was that they weren't serious, that they were entrapped, and they smoked a lot of pot and talked a tough game, but in the end, nothing happened. One of the defense attorneys described the alleged plot as, quote, laced with marijuana smoke and mirrors. Here, defense attorney Michael Hill says it was a government informant known as Big Dan who really prodded the conspiracy along.
I think what the FBI did is unconscionable, is what I think. And I think the jury just sent them a message loud and clear that these tactics are not going to be, we're not going to condone what they've done here.
And Rick, what happens now to the two men who didn't get a verdict?
Well, two of the defendants were acquitted, so they go free. But the other two, Adam Fox and Barry Croft, the jury deadlocked on the charges against those two, and the government says they will be tried again.
And what might prosecutors do in a new trial?
Well, among others, I spoke with Matthew Schneider, a former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. He says cases like this can turn on small things, like was it one juror who held out? A new jury presented with the same facts and the same testimony might reach a different conclusion.
What you take from this is only that the government failed to prove its case. What you cannot take from this verdict is that it's okay to threaten Governor Whitmer, or it's okay to do harm to her, because that's not right. And that's not what this verdict means.
And what has the governor's response been to this verdict?
Yes, her office put out a statement saying in part that a plot to kidnap and murder a governor might seem like an anomaly, but it is, in fact, a product of our times. I'll quote from it here. It is, quote, the result of violent, divisive rhetoric that is all too common across our country, end quote.
Rick Sluta, senior Capitol correspondent for the Michigan Public Radio Network. Thanks so much.
You bet. Thank you, Scott.
Leave them on and take them off. Talking about shoes in the house, of course. We're not sure what B.J. Liederman, who writes our theme music, does he wears shoes. But tomorrow on Weekend Edition Sunday with Leisha Roscoe, find out what the science has to say about being well-shod indoors. Tune in by telling your smart speaker to play NPR or your member station by name. Some 24 million birds in the U.S. have died from a bird flu virus this year, either directly or as a result of culling to prevent its spread. Unlike previous avian flus, this one is affecting wild birds also, and that could keep the virus in circulation for a long time. NPR's Nell Greenfield-Boyce reports.
The last time a deadly new bird flu showed up here 7 years ago, it really hit poultry farms.
In 2014-2015, we saw, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million domestic poultry affected.
Brian Richards says that virus didn't infect many wild birds. This time, it's different.
We've got wild bird detections in 32 states.
Richards is the Emerging Disease Coordinator at the U.S. Geological Survey's National Wildlife Health Center. He says this virus came across the Atlantic a few months ago, probably carried by migratory birds.
It can kill some waterfowl, but I think there's pretty clear evidence that some waterfowl likely are not affected by it, and therefore they're perfect transport mechanisms for taking it very long distances.
Since this virus arrived, it's killed birds that belong to more than 40 species, mostly ducks and geese, but also scavengers like black vultures and bald eagles that presumably eat the carcasses of birds killed by the virus. David Stalneck is a bird flu researcher with the University of Georgia. He says there have been large die-offs of ducks in Florida and snow geese in the Midwest.
This outbreak in the wild bird population is a lot more extensive than we saw in 2014-2015. Just a lot more birds appear to be affected.
So far, he hasn't seen indications that any species will lose so many birds that it will become threatened. But the spread of this virus in wild birds suggests that this outbreak may not burn itself out like the last one did. Ron Fouché is a flu expert at Erasmus Medical Center in the Netherlands.
There's a chance that the virus will stick around, and this will become a long-term problem.
He says that's what this virus has done in Europe, where it arrived a few years ago and never left. It's been causing massive die-offs in wild birds and continues to strike poultry flocks, resulting in the deaths of more than 17 million poultry birds since December. Fouché says there's only been one known human infection, a farmer in the United Kingdom who lived in close quarters with ducks that got this flu. That person tested positive but didn't have any symptoms.
We haven't seen any other farmers or veterinarians or other people being infected.
Still, since this bird flu arrived in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has been keeping a close watch. Todd Davis works on animal-to-human diseases at the agency. He says bird flu viruses related to this one have sickened and even killed people during past outbreaks in other countries. That's why public health officials here have been monitoring the health of more than 500 people in 25 states who've had contact with sick or dead birds.
Because humans have no prior immunity to these viruses typically, if they were to be infected and spread the virus to other humans, then we could have another pandemic virus on our hands, and so that's our primary concern.
Besides testing any people who show flu-like symptoms, they're also closely tracking genetic changes in the virus, looking for anything that would suggest it might become more of a threat to people. Nell Greenfield-Boyce, NPR News.
Now, a family that is split by the war in Ukraine. Kira Manilich and her husband Vladimir had been hoping to immigrate to the U.S. since last October. They even got the chance to apply for what's called a diversity visa. Then Russia invaded. Left with her son 6 weeks ago, while her husband stayed on in Ukraine along with other adult men in case he's needed for the military. Kira Manilich joins us now from the south of Italy, along with her sister Lena Manilich, who is in New York. Welcome to you both.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Hi, thank you.
And Lena Manilich, you came to the U.S. Before the war. Why?
I was so lucky. I came to the States 5 years ago, and I was also the one who won a green card lottery, diversity visa lottery.
Kira Manilich, why did you leave? What was life like there at the time you left? Maybe Lena Manilich, you can help us out with the answer.
Десь через декілька днів після того, як почалося вторгнення Росії до України,
So a few days after the war started, we started hearing sirens all the time, and I really didn't want to leave, but I was thinking about safety of my son, so that's why I made this very hard decision. And in the middle of the night, we packed all necessary stuff, and we decided to go to the border. My parents and my husband is still there. My parents cannot leave, my husband as well, because of the military state in the country. That was the decision I made, and we went to Italy.
Are you able to check in with your husband and your parents?
Так, зв'язок з ними є кожен день.
Yes, I can talk to them often on the phone. We're talking, I'm checking on them. That is good that it's available, but emotionally it's very hard.
Must be hard to talk to them knowing that they're still in danger.
Дуже тяжко, особливо коли ти знаєш, що в твоєму місті.
Yeah, especially when I know, and I know every time when there are sirens in my home city, so I text them all the time, how are you, is everything fine? That's really hard.
I understand your husband won what's called a diversity visa last year. These are visas given to citizens of countries with low immigration numbers, which Ukraine used to have. But getting a visa interview at the U.S. consulate was difficult, I gather.
Yes, it's difficult to get this visa because my husband is living in Ukraine. He's main applicant. Even if I have a date with interview, I can't go there.
Can I add something?
You're an immigration attorney, we should explain too, Lena.
Yes, so as Kira properly said, since all of this happened and there were no embassy, there is no embassy at this time in Ukraine, all the immigration cases were transferred to Frankfurt. Kira is waiting to get the date of the interview, but since her husband is of military age, he cannot leave to go for the interview.
Oh, mercy. Kira, would you want to come to the United States without your husband, just you and your son?
Взагалі-то він іноді.
I would really want to come to the States, and my husband wanted that as well, but then we decided that I'm going to wait for him where it's closer, meaning like in Italy, and then we can, hopefully we both will be able to come to the States.
Lena, let me turn to you as an immigration attorney. Does it seem to you like they'll have to wait until the end of the war, whenever that is?
As of now, they're extending this period every 30 days when they don't let men out of the country. So I really hope, that's my wish and prayers, that it's gonna end and he will be able to leave, because otherwise, yeah, he'll have to wait.
Is there a time limit on the visa?
Yeah, the diversity visa, they're giving visas only until the end of the fiscal year, which ends September 30th. So if they won't be able to get into the embassy until then, they will just won't be able to get their chance to get the visa that they want in allotment.
Kira, how are you getting along in Italy?
Я проживаю на півдні Італії в містечку.
I'm staying in South Italy at this time. It's near the sea, so usually in summer there are a lot of people, but now there's literally no one in that town. So we're staying here. We are doing some errands, like walk a lot. We're trying to not to read news because it's really hard and sad. But since we're staying here for some time already, my son will go to daycare starting next Monday.
You try not to watch too much of the news from your homeland, I gather.
I try, but I can't stop. It's reading because it's my country, my family. It's my home. It is so hard.
Kira Manilich in Italy and Lena Manilich, her sister, in New York City. Thank you both very much and good luck to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're listening to Weekend Edition from NPR News. Cincinnati is the birthplace of American Reform Judaism. Its Hebrew Union College has been ordaining rabbis for almost 150 years, but a financial deficit and low enrollment numbers have threatened the future of that rabbinical program. From member station WVXU, Jolene Almendarez reports.
There are 3 Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religious campuses in the U.S. New York, Los Angeles, and Cincinnati, the original campus. But with lowering Midwest enrollment numbers, coupled with a large deficit, the school's Board of Governors may eliminate rabbi ordinations in Cincinnati. That possibility brought out nearly 100 people to rally at the school Thursday. Steve Pollack moved to Cincinnati 30 years ago to join what he calls a community of Jewish people whose fabric is made of many threads.
I'm just here to ask that Cincinnati be given the opportunity to see what it can do to help make the Cincinnati HCC campus more than it was and more than it can be or more than it is today.
More than 350 rabbis across the country have signed a letter disapproving of the cost-cutting measures, but college officials who declined interview requests say the change is necessary. From 2006 to today, the Cincinnati campus has seen a nearly 60% decline in the size of its rabbinical classes. School officials have spent 2 years developing a strategic plan that addresses the institution's concerns. Cleveland Rabbi Robert Nosenchuk was not officially involved in that planning process, but says the changes are needed.
I believe strongly in the capacity of the president of Hebrew Union College and the remarkable team around them to meet and surmount the obstacles ahead, including how upset people are right now. And it's fair. People it's hard to accept that it's come to this state, but it has.
He says the cost-cutting measure is the only way the college can transform the way it trains prospective rabbis, like allowing them to do some online training without having to uproot their lives to move to coastal cities. These so-called low-residency rabbinical programs are increasingly popular. But for Cantor Elaine Katsu, who was ordained at the New York campus, not training rabbis in Cincinnati doesn't make sense.
Cincinnati, as a community, is nationally less expensive for cost of living and the cost of real estate, services, etc.
The school's Board of Governors, comprised of more than 50 rabbis, could vote on the changes in the next few days. If rabbi ordinations are stopped, officials say the Cincinnati campus won't close, but it will be used as a research college. For NPR News, I'm Jolene Almendavis in Cincinnati.
Weekend Edition is a production of NPR News, which is solely responsible for its content. Like a story you heard on this or another NPR program? Share it with a friend at npr.org. While there, you can also hear stories you missed, enjoy expanded content, or connect to your favorite member stations.
This is NPR News.
Hi, this is Washington correspondent Liz Ruskin. You're listening to Alaska Public Media on KSKA Anchorage, FM 91.1.
What does it mean to be Alaskan? Explore Northern identity through the Anchorage Museum's Cheddar Marks podcast. Join host Cody Liska as he talks about past, present, and future issues affecting life in the North with creative practitioners and changemakers from Alaska and beyond. Explore how Alaska's stories connect the North with the world. Search Cheddar Marks where you usually get your podcasts. This message sponsored by the Anchorage Museum. Support for Alaska Public Media comes from sustaining members and from Lazur and Lazur, who remind parents this uncertain time is an opportunity to teach their children how to find resilience in face of potential danger by remaining calm and protecting the common good of others.
I'm Windsor Johnston with these headlines. Civilian evacuations are moving ahead in parts of Ukraine a day after a missile strike killed at least 50 people at a train station in the eastern part of the country. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling the attack the latest sign of Russian war crimes. A judge says former President Donald Trump's company can continue running a public golf course in New York City. The ruling says the city offered a baseless rationale for canceling the Trump organization's contract after the January 6th insurrection. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear has vetoed a Republican-backed measure that would ban abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. State lawmakers could override the veto. I'm Windsor Johnston, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Dataiku, a platform for everyday AI to help organizations make AI part of their daily business, designed to elevate people, teams, and companies. DATAIKU.com. And from Uma, a cloud-based phone service for businesses of any size that comes with an automated virtual receptionist, video meetings, and mobility features to connect to customers and coworkers anywhere. More at ooma.com.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon. Colm Jobian, the great Irish poet and novelist, joins us now, so let's not fritter away any more time before he reads a poem. Colm, could you please read Prayer to St. Agnes?
O holy St. Agnes, cure me of metaphor. Make me say exactly what I mean without trickery or recourse to words that are not clear or clean. O martyr and saint, let life be dull, and make our verses unadorned, and let next year's poem be plainly full of signs that lessons have been learned. The flowers grow as appointed from the soil, and do not paint the meadow with delight. They wither or get picked, which serves to spoil our notion so mistaken on first sight, that they are sprightly dancing in the breeze, then taking applause, their heads all bowed. I swear in all mention of flowers, these rich, false words will never be allowed. In return, please open heaven's gate, so I can see what really is, with no sweet terms to mask my fate, to live in true, unsweetened bliss.
And that is Colin Tobin reading from his new collection, Vinegar Hill. The great poet is currently teaching at Columbia University in New York. And thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Why would a poet pray to be cured of metaphor?
I wanted the poems to be plainer, to really depend on single statement. That if you just write down something that's true and without adornment, that you would actually get maybe much more expression, or certainly a sort of power where you're not attempting in a way to do something poetic as much as attempting to, in a way, beguile the reader with the rhythm or with what's not in the poem as much as any set of tricks or any set of, I suppose, adornments.
Mm-hmm. An especially arresting poem, I think, for many people, is one that touches on mortality, 2 plus 1. Could I ask you to read that, please?
2 plus 1. My heart is watching and weakening, mercilessly counting the beats. It is bored, casually waiting for this to cease. My father died at 53, vessels leaked in his brain. Then arteries weakened, he moaned in pain. My mother's eyes were grey as his were blue. Her breath rose high above the town before it sank in death. I have their 2 weak hearts in 1 weak heart. Their eyes merged in my gaze, his slow smile, her soft side glance, oversee my days.
Oh my.
This is about 10 years old, this poem. When I couldn't believe, you get a miracle sometimes where they oversee my days, which the both meanings of, someone overseeing something, oversight, and then actually literally their eyes overseeing.
Yeah. Does a sense of frailty help you see the world in a different way, truer way?
And, I'd love to say that I had testicular cancer and I had really awfully difficult chemo and I was really sick. And, I'm not sure it's true. It might be a defense mechanism, but I love to say that I learned nothing. And that if you need cancer to teach you to appreciate life, then there's something really wrong to start with, And that I just lay there. It was boring, it was tough, it was hard, it was sometimes painful. But the idea that when it was over, I became a new man, or I found God, or I suddenly discovered, the joy of eating lobster or something. All the things that were in me just returned slowly, including my hair.
I had read that you were a late reader, and I wonder if that wound up strengthening your appreciation for words.
I think it left me free to imagine things, to wander around the house in a sort of dream. While my siblings were all busy, buried in books, I was sort of looking at them, checking them out, going into the other room to see what was going on there. I think it allows you to, in a certain way, when you're maybe 7 or 8, to become a better noticer.
Could I please get you to read a section from November in America?
Well, this is set in New York, and it's the very night that the voting has taken place, which will cause Donald Trump to become President of the United States. That night, there's hope in their Yankee hearts, as the ballots are being guarded against the truth. Soon, Twitter, fake news, and rage itself will be all the rage. And children will be held in cages, and dreams will be tossed and blown. But that night, we see them in all their innocence, loving the song and comforted by the singer. Walk on, walk on. Outside, it was November in America. We went to a bar. There was hope, some hope, in the hearts of those poised for power. It is sobering to remember we were not laughing anymore.
What did you want to capture in this poem?
It was a particularly dramatic occasion where there's a song called You Never Walk Alone. On our side of the Atlantic, it's the song sung by the Liverpool fans in a very raucous way at both home and away matches on a Saturday. It's sort of going, they just belt it out. That is what it is in Ireland and England. And of course, on the night I'm talking about, it's being sung very beautifully by Jesse Norman. and it's being sung with full emotion. So when she's going, walk on, it's pure, it's beautiful, and the audience, I mean, the Americans are really wowed by it. They love it. They're moved by it. I'm with an English friend, and we cannot stop ourselves. We're ready to burst with laughter. So it's one of those lovely moments where a cultural artifact means two entirely different things on a particular night where divisions in America are really becoming more and more apparent.
Yeah. One last poem we want to get you to read, and it's, if you could tell us the story, it's Pangor. And you're not the only poet to have addressed this, are you?
Pangor is one of the oldest Gaelic poems, and I mean, it's probably from the 6th century. Christianity has arrived in Ireland, and there's a monk, and he's writing that, well, he's hunting for the right word. His cat Pangor is hunting for mice. Seamus Heaney has done a version, Ivan Bolan has done a version, Paul Muldoon has done a version. Every Irish poet does a Pangor. Pangor. Pangor, our neighbour's cat, comes to my flat for peace and quiet. He likes to lick my bare toes while I type, but he cannot keep himself in check, and soon he starts to bite. Pangor, I bark, if you don't stop, I will put you back in the porn by that monk.
Which raises the question, is that how a poet settles scores?
That's what poems are for, to threaten your cat.
April's National Poetry Month. Do you like National Poetry Month?
I think America's great. I love America, and I love the way it does these things. If that happened in Ireland, everyone would be laughing about it. People would say, I mean, no poetry for April. They would, you know. But in America, these things are taken very seriously, and people pay a lot of attention, and poetry is something that really enriches people's lives. We know this because when there's a big ritual, for example, when there's a funeral or even a wedding, people often ask me, do you know a good poem for a wedding? Because they want something to mark the ceremony. So it isn't as though poems don't matter. They mightn't matter in everyone's daily life, but for those important occasions, poems really do matter.
Colm Tóibín, his collection, Vinegar Hill. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Hey, Tempest is alive in the spoken word genre with songs that include Priority Board.
Born brigade and self-esteem. Say it like you really mean to me. Build your life around secret.
That's from their fifth album, The Line is a Curve, an introspective performance that steers us through the daily rush of life and search for peace. Kay Tempest, the novelist, playwright, and musician, joins us now from London. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
That's a tough song to begin an album, isn't it?
It was the only choice, really. It was the first song that we wrote when we didn't have any idea what we were going to be making or where it might lead us. But also, once I had written the final song, Grace, and I knew where the album was going to end up, I fully understood even more why I wanted to start there, because there's, you know, for me that's the arc of the album, that it starts in that place of frustration or despair, it ends up in a place of acceptance, of love, but then the album wheels back around, you know, the line is a curve.
Kiss off the day with a mute mouth, past the commute. I can die faster than you. Build up resilience, build up views, but you can't build for long with partial truth.
Just because we have achieved this state of acceptance or the desire to love more fully, it doesn't mean that, you know, that's it. One epiphany doesn't make enlightenment. You've got to wake up in the morning and actually, you know, do the work.
That's a lot to put into an album. This album seems to be divided into sections, different sections on a journey between relationships, sickness, emotional health. Why take this approach?
It's interesting you say about the sections, because I definitely think of the album that way. I think the first three songs, they all share this minimal, synth-driven musicality. It's all the Moog 1, basically, this analog synth that sounds very much of its time, but also, I think, completely futuristic, even now. And then the album begins to warm up. Musically and lyrically, everything seems to warm up. The drums become live acoustic drums. We have the addition of brass, of guitars. Then we move into the third kind of movement of the suite, which is where we enter into the more electronic, kind of beat-heavy section, where things build to an almost kind of euphoric, relentless crescendo.
Let me ask you about the song No Prizes. This was in collaboration with Leanne LaHavas. And who sings this refrain over and over? Does there have to be a why as to why we keep climbing and go on living? I mean, isn't that why we're here? Or have I not given it enough thought?
No. However it reveals itself to you is exactly as it's supposed to be. You know, once a thing's written, it doesn't belong to me anymore. It's yours to make of it what you will. But in the moment of performance, it's entirely my creation. But once that performance is over, it belongs to whoever discovers it. Anyway, I love that chorus. I think what Leanne does with her vocal is so beautiful. I am obsessed with what melody can do to a lyric. We were in the studio, I had completely different lyrics for this song at the time. Leanne started to discover this melody, and it was syllabic at first. She's like, I want to say something like da-da. It's a two-syllable word. And for me to be led that way is just so refreshing, because normally for me the words are, they come first. They're the be-all and end-all. So for me to be following a melody was just so refreshing. And then when she discovered that chorus and started to sing it, then I started to think in pictures, because her song, her voice was transformative for me, for the lyrical possibility of where I wanted the track to go.
What are your dreams when they become ghosts in your ears, telling you things you just don't want to hear, like you're too late?
Tell us about the part called More Pressure.
More pressure, more release, more relief, more belief. More distance, more reach. The truth is, I don't know, it's so deep. I know nothing. I used to think things were so clear. I was so near to nowhere. I could feel everything in me, pushing for certain's a flimsy. Rock solid ground beneath me now tells me there's no ground at all.
What was your in there?
Well, this was a really crucial moment in the construction of the album. There's a moment when you're just creating music, you're just creating demos, you're following the ideas, and then there's a moment when you realise, oh, we have something here, we've caught something, you know?
Chin deep in a bag of white lies, saying I'm sick and tired of my own advice. I see it now, so perfect, but so hard to put into practice. One step forwards, two steps backwards. One soul's epiphanies, another soul's madness. I saw the truth in the curls of the vanishing girl, hands like cobwebs.
And then you start to really lead the process. You get in front and you ask the ideas to follow you. And this was one of those moments. My pen hit the page, and it's one of those moments when it just, first thought, best thought, they were already flowing even before I'd started to speak them out loud,
And that leads to Grace?
It was Grace, stunned by the last light of the sun. We were swimming in a green sea as deep as a gill. There are things I must record, must praise. There are things I have to say about the fullness and the blaze of this beautiful life.
Do you hope that there are people who listen to your songs, and I will call them songs, they're spoken art and spoken word and music art, and will recognize something from their own heart?
What I can say to that is that in my life I have received so much resonance, community, reflection from text and music, from other people. Sometimes when I hear somebody singing from a place of raw integrity or honesty or truth or however, it takes me to that place in myself, and it helps me, it really helps me to just recharge, because I think sometimes we forget that it's what we bring to the music that's as important as what we take from it.
That's performance, isn't it? Performance art.
Yeah.
Kay Tempest in London, their new album is The Line is a Curve. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm really excited.
In love and for love and with love. In love and for love and with love. surrender. I do.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon.
Get out of the way and tune into something more deep and reflective than what's to be achieved or perceived.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from C3AI. C3AI software enables organizations to use artificial intelligence at enterprise scale, solving previously unsolvable problems. C3AI is enterprise AI. And from DuckDuckGo, committed to making privacy online simple. Used by tens of millions, they offer internet privacy with one download. DuckDuckGo, privacy simplified. At duckduckgo.com.
We're waiting to find out who our nun is going to be as our teacher next year. This is really nerve-wracking because nuns were people to be feared. And at that point, I was just hoping I got one that smiled and not one that threw erasers or, hit kids with rulers.
Join us for Stories of Our Elders. That's on the Moth Radio Hour from PRX.
Saturday at 1 p.m. on Alaska Public Media, FM 91.1.
COVID has packed a wallop in Anchorage, and we aren't done with it yet. Alaska Public Media has joined with 20 community groups to meet COVID concerns with trusted voices and accurate information for a project called Talk to Your Neighbor. So did you avoid the vaccine? Are you hesitant to get boosted? What changed your mind? Tell us at 550-8480 24/7 and record your experience. That's 550-8480. Leave us a message.
You're listening to KSKA Anchorage, also translating as K220 AL Girdwood, K216 BN Prudhoe Bay, and K261 EI Anchorage.
In Washington, D.C. This is Weekend Edition. I'm Scott Simon. This hour, the latest is many of Washington, D.C.'s elite test positive, for COVID that is. Also, are China and Russia now aligned against the U.S. and Europe? Did major media fail in failing to report about emails on Hunter Biden's laptop? A powerful new film about the grim life of a dairy cow. And Julia Efron's new memoir of losing any closer to her than contending with leukemia. But a love straight out of one of her movies comes along.
I was dealing with so much grief, and falling in love was like beautiful magic. There's nothing like falling in love.
But it wasn't with Tom Hanks. First, our newscast. It's Saturday, April 9, 2022.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Windsor Johnston. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is once again calling on the West for support as Russia steps up its attacks in parts of the country. Speaking remotely at a global event called Stand Up for Ukraine today, Zelensky said the democratic world has the power to help.
They have to do everything to force Russia to seek peace. They have to do everything to hold Russian soldiers and their commanders accountable for their crimes against the Ukrainian people.
Zelensky's plea comes a day after a missile strike hit a train station where thousands of Ukrainians were trying to flee the ongoing conflict. At least 50 people were killed, including 5 children. As NPR's Ada Peralta reports, evacuations have resumed in the country today, with the government urging residents to leave the east while they can.
Government officials say Russian troops are regrouping and that they will soon launch a full-scale attack in the east. Local authorities say that the train station that was hit in Kramatorsk was badly damaged, so it was closed, but other stations are still working. The government says the Russian military is increasing its shelling, so it wants to get civilians out. It says it will try to keep the remaining stations from getting too crowded to avoid mass casualties in the case of another strike. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Department of Health says that nearly 100 people are being treated at hospitals. Among them are 19 children, some of whom have had limbs amputated, and they say that about 20% of the patients are in critical condition. Ada Peralta, NPR News, Kyiv.
The vaccine mandate for federal workers that has been blocked for months by an injunction can start to be enforced after an appeals court ruled in the Biden administration's favor this week. NPR's Selena Simmons-Duffin reports it's not clear yet what that means for workers.
A panel of judges in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals found that the lower court judge who had blocked the vaccine requirement didn't have jurisdiction. They reasoned that if a federal worker has a problem with the vaccine rule, they need to use an internal review process, not sue in federal court. Erin Fusay-Brown teaches law at Georgia State University.
In theory, yes, the federal government, as an employer, could start enforcing the vaccine mandate.
But the people who might be affected are only a very small portion of the workforce. As of December, only 3% of federal workers were still unvaccinated and did not have an approved exemption. And the federal government has not commented on how or whether it will begin enforcing the requirement. Selena Simmons-Duffin, NPR News.
You're listening to NPR News in Washington. The French are going to the polls on Sunday to vote for their next president in the first of 2 rounds of voting. NPR's Eleanor Beardsley reports far-right candidate Eric Zemmour has become the new standard bearer for xenophobic nationalist ideas and rhetoric.
Supporters of Eric Zemmour chanted, "This is our home," in a recent rally. That used to be the rallying cry of Marine Le Pen supporters, but this time around she's stuck to bread-and-butter economic issues. Zemmour, a former right-wing television pundit, espouses anti-Muslim, anti-immigration themes. But he's fallen in the polls since the war in Ukraine, partly because of his pro-Putin positions. Still, several Zemmour supporters told NPR you can't trust the polls. They point to the example of former President Donald Trump beating Hillary Clinton and say Zemmour could win too. Eleanor Beardsley, NPR News, Paris.
The largest city in China says it will soon begin lifting lockdown orders in communities that report 0 cases of coronavirus infections. Officials in Shanghai say that decision will come after another round of testing. Many parts of the city have been under strict lockdown measures since March 28th, which has led to complaints of food shortages and other basic necessities. Online businesses say they're sold out, and delivery services have been unable to keep up with demand. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security. More information is available online at carnegie.org.
Hi, this is Kavitha George, host of Alaska Morning News. You're listening to Alaska Public Media on KSKA Anchorage, FM 91.1, connecting Alaskans, life informed.
Weekend edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon. Some of the most powerful political figures in the nation's capital contracted COVID-19 this week. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senator Susan Collins of Maine, Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. Many of them tested positive after they attended the Gridiron Club dinner a week ago, an annual event for political and media elite. And it reflects a surge in cases in some parts of the country. NPR's Selena Simmons-Duffin joins us.
Hi, good morning.
What do we know about this this outbreak? A dinner that's being called a super spreader event?
Right, so not everyone on the high profile list of positive cases were at the dinner, but at least 50 people who attended did test positive afterwards. Now, guests had to show proof of vaccination, but attendees did not uniformly wear masks, and there were no negative test requirements. And this is in the context of cases, as you say, rising here in DC, and the dominant variant in the US right now, BA2, is extremely contagious. And there were about 700 people indoors at this event, and that's still risky.
Of course, President Biden worked closely with many of those people who did get infected. He's 79 years of age. He has had a second booster. What does the White House say about the president's risk of exposure?
Yeah, in fact, the president usually attends the annual dinner, but this year, President Biden did not. He sent a video message instead. I asked Natalie Quillian, the outgoing deputy coordinator for the White House COVID-19 response team, about the president's risk, and here's what she said.
Is it possible that he, like many Americans, could get COVID? It is possible. But also, like many Americans, we believe and he can move forward safely with his routines as President of the United States.
She said the president has strong protocols and his vaccine doses protecting him.
Selena, this week, a federal appeals court upheld the vaccine mandate for federal employees that had been blocked for months. What does this mean for workers?
Well, this was a panel in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the judges said that the lower court judge who had blocked it didn't have jurisdiction. They reasoned that if a federal worker has a problem with the vaccine rule, they need to use an internal review process, not sue in federal court. Erin Fusay-Brown teaches law at Georgia State University. She told me in practical terms, the injunction's gone.
And so, in theory, yes, the federal government, as an employer, could start enforcing the vaccine mandate.
But the people who might be affected here are only a very small portion of the workforce, maybe like 3%, who both are unvaccinated and do not have an exemption. And it's not clear if the federal government is going to jump in and start enforcing this. The White House's Quillian told me they're just working through next steps at this point.
Finally, Congress left for spring recess without passing another package of COVID spending. This one would have been worth $10 billion. What happens now?
Well, already uninsured people can no longer get free vaccines or tests or treatments across the country. The administration warns more cuts are coming if Congress can't get more funding approved soon. Quillian told me the White House wants even more, $22.5 billion. And she pointed to a study from Yale and the Commonwealth Fund out yesterday that they assessed the value of the vaccination campaign so far.
It said we've avoided almost $900 billion in healthcare costs and saved 2 million lives. I think an investment of $22 billion to save even more lives and prevent even more costs to our economy and our healthcare system is well worth it.
She said she hopes lawmakers act quickly on this when they get back to Washington on April 25th.
That's NPR's Selena Simmons-Duffin. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Vladimir Putin made a grand appearance with the president of China, Xi Jinping, in Beijing in February. China has so far been largely silent about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Is there a new coalition formed? Al Brands is a professor of global affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You've argued that Russia and China are part of what you call a coalescing autocratic axis at the heart of Eurasia. That does not sound reassuring.
No, and it probably shouldn't. I think for a long time, Americans thought about Russia and China as two distinct challenges, and in many ways they are. But one of the things that we've seen before and during this crisis is that they increasingly act together, or at least in parallel, in important ways. And so the Chinese have certainly shrugged off any effort to get them to put pressure on Russia to end the war, but they have also given the appearance of support for Russia's war in many cases. So the problem that we confront today is one in which our two greatest autocratic rivals increasingly work together.
And is that the overriding mutual interest they have in policy at the moment, to be able to hold the United States responsible for everything?
They have two overriding mutual interests. The first is that both would be classified as countries that want to change the existing international system because they think it is unfairly slanted against them. It denies them spheres of influence, for instance, and they see the United States as the primary obstacle to that objective. The second mutual interest is more ideological. Both of these countries are increasingly personalistic autocracies in a world that is led by a democratic superpower, and so they would very much like to create an international system that is more protective of autocracies like their own.
What do you think this suggests to the U.S. now as it confronts Russia's actions in Ukraine?
Well, there's long been a debate in the United States over whether we should prioritize competing with Russia or China or treat them as co-equals. And that debate has flared up again in the context of this war. I think what the war indicates, though, is that the best way of putting pressure on China, which is the more dangerous and the more powerful of the two rivals, is actually to ensure that Russia is defeated, that it does not achieve its objectives in this war, because that will result in a weaker Russia, one that is less capable of putting pressure on the United States and its allies in Europe, and thus less useful as a strategic partner for Beijing.
Whatever happened to the idea that forging close commercial ties with China would bring China closer to a democratic system?
We tried that for about 25 years, but I think we basically underestimated the tenacity and the ruthlessness of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP understood that the policy of economic engagement was ultimately meant to lead to the liberalization of the Chinese political system. I mean, that, of course, was not what the CCP wanted. And so the Chinese Communist Party essentially used the wealth that China was able to accrue through its insertion in the international economy to buy off the Chinese populace to a certain degree, to invest in its own repressive capabilities, and to undertake one of the largest peacetime military buildups in the modern era.
In your judgment, what's the best option for the United States now?
The United States simply can't avoid the reality that it has to contain both Russia and China simultaneously. And if the United States were to try to buy one or both of them off, it would simply weaken its own position. That's a tall order, but it's not impossible. If you add up the United States and its allies in Europe and its allies in the Indo-Pacific, they dramatically outstrip Russia and China together when it comes to military power, economic power, diplomatic power, you name it. And I think that there is also a prospect that putting pressure on Russia can, over the long term, lead to a fraying of the relationship with China. As Russia becomes more dependent on China as a result of this war, it will become less and less comfortable with that dependency. And so this won't make a huge difference over a 2 to 3 year period, but over a 10-year period, perhaps.
Hal Brands is the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Last weekend we told you about the Flea Club, an apparel store in Chicago that had been robbed 4 times in 2 years, and that made it impossible for the owners to buy store insurance. But just hours after we interviewed the owners, Flea Club got robbed again.
It was usually around like 3 in the morning. This time it was like 5:50 a.m. I got an alert from my ADT system. I looked on my cameras and my clothing racks turned over. People running around in my shop. It's just a bad thing every time I see it.
Darius Kelly runs the store with his longtime friend, Sabrine Sledge. Security footage shows a team of thieves breaking through glass and metal shutters, then loading up an SUV with armfuls of jeans, designer jackets, and high-end sneakers. Mr. Kelly estimates they took close to $70,000. Flea Club stayed open after the previous 4 robberies. Not this time.
Oh, it's closed. It's closed. It's just too much.
He says the last few years have been rough in his hometown.
It's been something like I haven't seen, you know? It's just been a different Chicago. All the break-ins, all the carjackings, all the robberies. It seems like people are less living lawless.
The Chicago Police Department says murders are down compared to last year, but burglaries, robberies, theft, and car theft have all increased a lot. Now, merchandise has been recovered, and Darius Kelly says he doesn't know of anyone who's been arrested for any of the break-ins at his store. He'd like to see more police on the streets and tougher penalties for thieves who get caught. For now,
I'm really at a standstill. I really don't know what to do. I'm processing things. I'm trying to get my money together. I just probably want to leave Chicago, go to a different city, try to start over. I put a lot into my business, so I know it's not going to happen overnight, but I don't think I can deal with this. It's getting in my psyche.
He's raising money on a GoFundMe page and thinks he might move south, maybe to Texas, open a new store there.
I love what I do. I love getting people their shoes, getting people fly, getting people their nice clothes, stuff like that. It's just kind of hard right now. Just determining my next move.
Terrace Kelly, co-owner of Chicago's Flea Club, which is now closed. And you're listening to NPR News.
Hi, this is Casey Grove, host of Alaska News Nightly. You're listening to Alaska Public Media on KSKA Anchorage FM 91.1.
The Alaska Humanities Forum invites you to be curious, not judgmental, an online series of workshops for navigating challenging conversations about COVID-19 vaccines. These workshops are designed to meet people wherever they are, regardless of their position and beliefs about vaccines. The series is in partnership with the Alaska Children's Trust, with funding from United Way and the municipality of Anchorage, Anchorage Health Department. Learn more at akhf.org. This message sponsored by the Alaska Humanities Forum.
I'm Windsor Johnston with these headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the missile strike on an eastern train station that killed at least 50 people is another Russian war crime. During his nightly video address on Friday, Zelensky said great efforts will be taken to make sure those behind the attack will be held responsible. The governor of Kentucky has vetoed a Republican-backed measure to ban abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. The bill would also regulate the dispensing of abortion pills. Jury deliberations are underway for a former Virginia police officer charged in the January 6th insurrection. Attorneys for Thomas Robertson are encouraging the jury to convict him of misdemeanor offenses instead of felony charges. I'm Windsor Johnston, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Mathnasium, committed to boosting students' confidence, critical thinking, and math grades and scores with in-person or online instruction. Each student follows a customized learning plan. More at mathnasium.com. And from Culligan Water, since 1936. A local Culligan specialist can provide in-home water tests and custom recommendations to treat the unique attributes of a home's water. More at Culligan.com.
This is Weekend Edition from NPR News. I'm Scott Simon. The president of Yemen, Abd Rabbu Mansur Hadi, stepped down this week in an effort to end a bitter 7-year civil war. He transferred his power to a presidential council on Thursday that will replace his decade-long reign. Yemen's been embroiled in what's basically a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, with Iran-backed Houthi rebels fighting the Saudi-led coalition there. More than 14,000 civilians have been killed in the war, which has set off one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Nadwa al-Dosari is a Yemeni analyst and non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute who joins us. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Scott, for having me.
How significant do you find this transfer of power by the president of Yemen?
It's very significant, and it came as a surprise to many of us Yemenis.
Could it lead to an end of violence and maybe the civil war?
That's a far-fetched assumption. In reality, this has been a Saudi-UAE arrangement imposed on Yemenis. None of the participants in the Riyadh conference knew about it. Even members of the Presidential Council did not know that they were selected, and even Hadi did not know until that night. He was practically forced to transfer his powers, which is not a bad thing. Hadi was an extremely incompetent and corrupt leader, and because of his lack of leadership, we've been in a political and military stalemate. Having said that, there are two sets of challenges. One, the Houthis do not recognize the council. They never recognized Hadi. They basically called the council a recycle of Saudi mercenaries. The Houthis are not interested in ending the violence, and that's one of the major problems that will face this council and any efforts to reach peace. On the other hand, also, members of the council, there are 8, they come from different backgrounds, they have different objectives, so it will be challenging to bring them together to agree on issues, and they will have to agree on major issues.
Yeah.
These members have been handpicked by the Saudis and the Emiratis, so they will be more accountable to their regional backers more than the Yemeni people. What happens when they disagree? Is Yemen going to become even a platform for proxy war between the Saudis and the Emiratis, and how that will manifest in Yemen? So I think it's too early to be optimistic.
The U.S., of course, is a major supplier of weapons to Saudi Arabia, which has fueled the violence in the war. Does the United States have a role now?
The problem with the U.S. are two things. The U.S. is selling weapons to the Saudis and the Emiratis unconditionally. The U.S. should have put conditions on selling the weapons, not only on, that these weapons should not be used to harm civilians, but also that there should have been a plan, a clear plan by the Saudis and the Emiratis about their military intervention in Yemen. The second problem with the U.S. role is that the U.S. does not have leverage on the Houthis. And that's a problem because the Houthis are the main obstacle to peaceful negotiations.
Do you see any event occurring over the next few weeks or development that could let us know if the new coalition, as the Presidential Council, is working out?
There's been some rumors that there's been some back-channel agreements between the Houthis and the Saudis. I wouldn't be surprised if it happens because clearly the Saudis are very desperate to leave Yemen and their role in the country. They just want the cross-border attacks to stop. So we might see something like that. We might not see something like that. So that's something to watch for.
Nadwa Al-Dasari is a Yemeni analyst and non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
The United Nations voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council this week. While many countries supported the suspension, plenty didn't. Later today, in All Things Considered, find out why more than 50 countries decided to abstain from voting. You can tune in by telling your smart speaker to play NPR or your member station by name. There's fresh scrutiny on Hunter Biden, the president's son, as he is under investigation. Part of that investigation appears to center on emails that showed up on a notorious laptop that was publicized before the 2020 election and then dismissed by much of the news media. Many of these emails have now been authenticated. NPR's David Folkenflik joins us now. David, thanks so much for being with us. Pleasure.